Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's Donald Parker from CyberSecStudy. This is episode number 3 of the Intro to Cyber program. So this program is geared towards those who are looking to break into the field of cybersecurity, or for those who are already in the field and just looking for recommendations or suggestions on things they can do, new techniques they can try in their day-to-day activities. So I'm going to finish up the discussion on risk. We'll distinguish the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk assessments, and we'll finish up with discussion about the difference between risk management and risk assessment. So first thing to discuss is what is qualitative versus quantitative. A qualitative risk assessment is a risk assessment like the ones we talked about in episodes 1 and 2, where you're using the ratings of high, medium, or low. You could do very high, high, medium, low, very low, 5 different categories, or 3. But the key point about qualitative risk assessment is that it's those ratings are based on subjective opinion of subject matter experts, right? So the people in your organization who know a lot about the business, who are experts in a particular field, they understand the assets of the corporation, they understand the business processes really well. But they subjectively determine what the risk ratings are. With a quantitative risk assessment, there's no subjective reasoning. It's all based on real data, real analytics collected over time. You could have a intrusion detection system that's detecting suspected incidents. You could have vulnerability scanners running periodically and detecting things, or you could have individuals within the organization identify suspicious activity. But over a period of time, usually a year or so, you calculate the exact number of suspected incidents, the number of actual incidents, and the amount of damage that they cause to your assets. And you can quantify those with real numbers, dollar amounts, a count of how many incidents took place, things like that. So it's a little difficult to do a quantitative assessment, more difficult than a qualitative. And I always recommend that you start with a qualitative assessment, build in quantitative elements over time. And anyone studying for the CISSP, you've probably heard that a purely quantitative risk assessment isn't possible, and I agree with that statement. You can have a risk assessment include a lot of quantitative elements, but to have it purely based on quantitative metrics is it's just not very likely. You're always going to have some kind of subjective element, and if you have just one subjective element and 15 quantitative elements, then the assessment is not purely quantitative. All right, so we'll walk through. I'll pull up some slides here, and we'll walk through an actual qualitative assessment, kind of similar to what we did the first 2 episodes, and then we'll walk through the harder quantitative assessment. So for qualitative, the first step in a qualitative risk assessment is to determine your likelihood rating. Well, we did that last episode with the definitions for likelihood. You have a definition for high, for medium, and for low. And these definitions, you can find examples from NIST 800-30. But those are just recommendations. You can tweak those definitions and tailor them to your liking, or if they don't match or don't fit within your organization that well, then you can tweak them. So step number one of a qualitative risk assessment, determine your likelihood rating, high, medium, or low. Your subject matter expert does that. Step number two is determine your impact rating. Again, we use the definitions for impact. And then number three is to determine the overall risk rating. We did that in the last episode as well, where we use the risk rating matrix. And then step number four is to handle the risk. And most people I talk to, whenever they talk about handling risk, they only mention mitigating risk. And that's just one of four ways you can handle risk. But another statement you'll always hear is that, risks can never be completely eliminated. You're always going to have some level of risk. And while that's a true statement, I don't like it that much because it gives people outside of our field the impression that, well, why do we do anything then? To which my reply is always, if you knew you lived in a hurricane zone, and there's nothing you could do to stop the hurricane, wouldn't you still take measures to protect yourself if you knew a storm was coming? So you always do the best you can. You always try to make your environment less susceptible than someone else's environment. Harden it as much as possible so that an attacker, will go after lower hanging fruit. All right, so the methods for handling a risk include reducing it, which is mitigation. Mitigating a risk is if you have a high risk and you implement a security control that doesn't eliminate the risk but lowers it to a moderate or a low. That's risk mitigation. Number two, transfer the risk, and you can do that with a insurance policy or a service level agreement with another organization or another department within your organization. You can avoid risk by eliminating the vulnerability or the feature of the asset that makes it vulnerable. So if you don't want system users to download data, then remove all CD-ROM drives, disable the USB ports, make it so that it can't be done, right? And then number four, accept the risk. You're not going to ignore it. You're not going to forget about it, but some risk, it's going to cost too much to mitigate or to transfer or avoid, and you make the conscious decision to accept it. You'll keep an eye on it. You'll see if the threats increase. You'll see if the value of your asset increases or decreases over time, and make a conscious decision. So now we'll talk about a quantitative risk assessment. And again, this deals with real data. The CISSP course material, when they define a quantitative risk assessment, they just talk about identifying threats and then performing a threat assessment. They don't talk about vulnerabilities. So I'll display it the way they do, but I would add another step in there to include vulnerabilities. But step number one of a quantitative risk assessment is to identify and evaluate your assets, like we did in our spreadsheet in the last episode. Identify all your assets, assign a value to them, and keep in mind that those values can increase or decrease over time, and you'll need to adjust them in the spreadsheet. Step number two of a quantitative risk assessment is to identify threats. And we've got a method for doing that that I'll show here in a minute. Number three is to perform threat assessment. And then number four is to handle the risk. And we handle the risk the same way we did with a qualitative assessment. So the second step of the quantitative risk assessment was to identify threats. And to do that using quantifiable metrics, they use a formula called single loss expectancy, SLE, and SLE equals the asset value times the exposure factor. So you've assigned a value to your assets, and now you're going to determine with exposure factor how much of that asset is potentially a danger, right? So if you've got a two-story, four apartment complex, two apartments on the bottom, two on the top, and you're in a flood zone, then you could theoretically say your exposure factor is 50%, right? And exposure factor is usually expressed as a percentage. But you'd say 50 because the two bottom units are more exposed than the upper two units. Step 3 of a quantitative risk assessment is to perform a threat assessment. And you do that by calculating the annualized loss expectancy. How much of your asset do you expect to lose over a year? And ALE equals single loss expectancy, which we just saw in step number 2. So single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. How many times throughout a year did you experience that single loss? And then step 4, we handle the risk the same ways we did with a qualitative assessment. We either reduce/mitigate it, transfer it, avoid it, or accept it. Never ignore it. And that's pretty much it. So again, I recommend starting with a qualitative risk assessment. Build in those quantitative metrics over time. See if you can add in or start calculating single loss expectancy, annual loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence. All right, so the last topic for this episode is simply the difference between risk management and risk assessment. And I know a lot of folks mix those two terms up, but essentially a risk assessment is a component of risk management, right? So risk management is step number 1 is prepare for an assessment. And you can do that by, getting senior leadership and senior managers together and developing a policy for risk management, how you're going to conduct it. Are you going to use 3 categories? Or are you going to use 4? Or are you going to start with qualitative only? Or are you going to start with qualitative and some quantitative elements? So make all those decisions in step number 1. Step number 2 of risk management is to conduct the assessment. And we just talked about the 2 ways you can do that, qualitative or quantitative. Step number 3, communicate the results to senior leadership. And then step number 4 is to maintain the assessment. Risk management is an ongoing process. It never ends. You're always continuously assessing risk and monitoring threats and vulnerabilities and assessing the likelihood versus the impact of a threat overcoming a vulnerability. All right, that's it for this episode. Hit the like button if you like. Smash the subscribe button if you feel so inclined. Leave me a comment below if you want to, and you can find me on Twitter at CyberSecStudy.